The pass is quiet now. The screams are gone. The clash of bronze has faded into wind moving through broken shields and trampled grass, and the bodies of the famous are already being claimed by myth, while the unnamed are left to rot where they fell. Thermopylae is remembered as a place of courage, of last stands and defiance, of men who chose death rather than retreat. But history has a habit of ending stories too early, cutting away just as the real consequences begin. Because while the warriors died in glory, their homes did not, their wives did not, their daughters did not. When the dust settled and the Persians marched on, the legend stopped. But the war did not. What followed was quieter, slower, and infinitely more personal. The kind of destruction that does not echo on battlefields, but in houses, in beds, in chains, and in the long, silent dismantling of lives that no one thought to record. For the women of Sparta, Thespiae, and the smaller towns scattered across central Greece, the stand at Thermopylae was not just a military maneuver. It was a promise, a belief, quietly held, rarely spoken, that the men at the pass were not only defending land, but shielding everything behind them. Homes, families, futures. The logic felt solid. If the Persians were stopped here, the villages would be spared. If the line held, the war would remain distant, contained in that narrow strip of stone and sea. But that belief was built on a misunderstanding. Greek warfare had rules, rituals, expectations. Persian warfare did not share those limits. To the Achaemenid Empire, victory was not only measured in territory taken, but in populations absorbed, resources claimed, and human lives repurposed. The women waiting beyond the mountains did not yet know that the men who had sworn to protect them were about to be erased, and that with their deaths, the last barrier between safety and captivity would vanish with them. When the final defenders fell and the pass opened, the protection they had trusted collapsed in a single moment. No warning reached the villages, no time remained to flee. The promise of safety died on the same ground as the warriors, leaving behind a vacuum that the Persian war machine would move into without hesitation, without sentiment, and without mercy. The Persian advance was not a tide. It was a system. Columns moved with registers, scribes, supply chains, and a hierarchy that understood conquest as administration, not chaos. Cities were not merely defeated, they were catalogued. Populations were not simply displaced, they were processed. To the Achaemenid Empire, war was an extension of governance, and governance was an extension of ownership. Xerxes did not need to improvise. His empire had been absorbing peoples for generations, refining methods of control that turned defeat into productivity. Captives were counted, skilled workers were identified, families were broken into categories of use. Women were not seen as bystanders to war, but as part of its economy, its reward structure, its political currency. They were labor, leverage, and legacy all at once. When Thermopylae fell, the machinery did not pause to admire the victory. It pivoted. The same system that moved grain and silver now moved people. The same officers who mapped terrain now mapped lives. Nothing was personal. That was the most terrifying part. There was no rage, no frenzy, no need for cruelty to be loud. The empire did not need to scream. It simply took. The Persian army did not rush. It unfolded. Town by town, valley by valley, the coastline was stripped of resistance like bark from a tree. Phocian villages were emptied. Boeotian homes were opened without ceremony. In Attica, smoke rose where doors had once stood, and the sea carried the sound of oars long after the men who should have answered them were already dead. There were no battles here, no heroic last stands, only doors breaking, only footsteps, only the quiet terror of being found. Women were gathered in courtyards, in temples, in the open spaces where markets had once lived. Children were pulled from arms, mothers were counted. Elderly were ignored. The process was efficient, almost gentle in its order, and that was what made it unbearable. No shouting, no explanation, just motion and separation, and the sudden understanding that the world they knew had ended without their consent. The villages emptied, as if drained. What remained were ash, abandoned tools, half-finished meals, and the echo of lives interrupted. The soldiers did not linger. They moved on, leaving behind silence where families had been, and carrying forward a human cargo that would never again belong to itself. There was no clash of armies when the women were taken, no warning horns, no shields raised, no final chance to run. The fighting was already over. The men were already gone. What remained were unguarded lives standing in open space, exposed by absence. The Persians did not need to conquer these settlements. They simply entered them. Capture did not feel like an event. It felt like a process. A hand on the arm, a gesture toward a line, a step forward that could not be refused. The absence of violence made the reality harder to grasp. No blood meant no signal, no screams meant no resistance. The women moved because there was nowhere else to move, because refusal had no language, because compliance was the only shape survival could take. In that moment, something invisible broke. Not bones, not walls, something deeper, the understanding that their bodies, their futures, their very presence now belonged to someone else. They were no longer daughters of a city or wives of fallen men. They were assets, and the empire had come to collect. Movement became the next form of control. Once gathered, the women were not left in place. They were turned into columns, lines of bodies walking under guard through roads they had once traveled freely, past fields they would never touch again. The march was slow, deliberate, public, a display as much as a relocation. The empire did not hide what it was doing. It wanted the land to watch itself being emptied. There was no destination explained, no timeline given, only motion, dust in the mouth, sun on uncovered heads, the sound of sandals and hooves, and the constant pressure of being kept together. Some carried infants, some supported the elderly. Most walked in silence, conserving breath, conserving strength, learning quickly that weakness drew attention. This was not transport. It was conditioning. The first lesson in a new life, where direction would always be given, never chosen. Where waiting would replace deciding. Where the body would move when ordered and stop when allowed. By the time the camps came into view, many had already begun to understand. The capture was not the end of something. It was the beginning of something far more controlled. At the camps, the lines dissolved into categories: age, health, appearance, origin. The empire sorted what it had taken the way a quartermaster sorted supplies, not with cruelty, but with purpose. Officers selected first, then allied contingents, then the ranks. The order was understood without being announced. Power always chooses before need. There was no ceremony, no declaration, a nod, a gesture, a name spoken, and a woman was moved from one side to another, from the mass into possession. Some were taken immediately, others were marked to be sent onward. None were asked. The absence of choice was complete. What had been community only days before was now inventory, and the men making these decisions did so with the calm efficiency of those accustomed to being obeyed. This was not chaos, it was reward. A system of compensation that turned human beings into currency, service for loyalty, bodies for victory. And in that exchange, the women of fallen Greece became proof that the empire paid its soldiers not only in silver, but in lives. For many, the destination was not a market or a workshop. It was a tent, a residence, a private space where ownership was immediate and unquestioned. The transition was swift and irreversible. One moment, part of a column, the next confined to a single man's world, expected to adapt, to submit, to survive within rules that were never explained but strictly enforced. The language changed, the clothing changed, the name often disappeared. What remained was function. In Persian elite culture, concubinage was structured, normalized, and deeply embedded in status. To possess foreign women was not shameful, it was symbolic, evidence of reach, proof of victory, a living reminder that entire cities now bent under imperial authority. For the women, this meant life lived under constant surveillance, with no legal protection, no recognized will, and no future that belonged to them alone. This was not a single night of violence. It was an ongoing condition, a permanent state, a slow erasure carried out in private rooms behind guarded walls, where resistance had no audience and endurance became the only form of agency left. Some women were not kept with soldiers. They were forwarded, sent onward through administrative channels to provincial centers and royal households, absorbed into the interior machinery of the empire. The journey did not feel like rescue. It felt like disappearance. Names were replaced with roles, origins were reduced to labels. Greek became a memory, then a liability, then a silence. Inside palace compounds, life was controlled by walls rather than chains, by ritual rather than force. The spaces were beautiful, the rules were absolute. Movement was regulated, speech was monitored. Contact with the outside world was severed without explanation. To an observer, it looked like comfort. To those inside, it was a carefully decorated confinement, a life shaped entirely by someone else's will. Here, obedience was not demanded. It was assumed. The women were dressed, instructed, trained to exist within a hierarchy that offered no exit and no future beyond service. The empire did not need to brutalize them. It simply absorbed them, the way stone absorbs water, until even memory softened and the past became something too painful to hold. For others, there was no palace and no private household. There was only sale, transfer, assignment. The machinery of empire absorbed them into workshops, estates, and service roles that stretched from Asia Minor to the heart of Persia. They were woven into textile production, food preparation, domestic labor, and agricultural work. Quiet systems that depended on invisible hands. The conquest fed itself. Here, survival meant usefulness. Skill could delay punishment. Endurance could earn tolerance. But nothing restored ownership of self. Their days were measured in tasks, not time. Their worth recalculated with every harvest, every shipment, every household need. The idea of return dissolved quickly. Distance did the rest. The farther they were moved, the less real their former lives became, until memory felt like something imagined. This was not temporary displacement. It was permanent conversion. Free women turned into infrastructure. Lives reduced to function. The empire did not need to destroy them. It simply needed them to work. With time, the most complete violence was not physical. It was administrative. Names were replaced with designations. Lineage meant nothing. Family meant nothing. Language became a liability, then a silence. A woman who could not speak was easier to command. A woman who could not remember was easier to keep. The empire understood this. Identity was not taken in a single act. It was dismantled in layers. Clothing changed first, then routine, then expectation. Greek customs faded into disuse, not by force but by irrelevance. There was no space for them in the new order. Children born into captivity learned only the language of their masters. Mothers learned to speak less, to ask less, to expect nothing. Over time, even memory became dangerous because it reminded them of what had been lost and could never be returned. This was not assimilation, it was replacement. The slow removal of self until what remained was compliant, functional, and untraceable, not conquered, not even broken, simply rewritten. What is most striking is not what was written, it is what was not. Greek historians recorded battles, speeches, strategies, and sacrifices in obsessive detail, yet when it came to the women left behind, the record thins into almost nothing. Herodotus describes the march of armies. He names kings. He measures distances. But the fate of captured women is passed over with a few sterile words, if it is mentioned at all. As if what happened to them was too ordinary to deserve ink. This was not ignorance, it was priority. Greek memory was built around male valor, civic pride, and heroic death. Suffering that did not fit the ideal was inconvenient. It complicated the story. The women did not die with spears in their hands, so their loss did not become legend. It became background, an accepted consequence, absorbed quietly into the cost of war and never examined again. Silence became a form of burial. No tombs, no epics, no commemorations. The men of Thermopylae were immortalized in stone and poetry. The women were erased by omission, and in that erasure, the full price of the battle was hidden in plain sight. Over time, Thermopylae was carved into something clean. A story of bravery, of unity, of noble sacrifice. The past became a symbol rather than a place, a moral lesson rather than a human event. Statues were raised, speeches were quoted. The narrative froze at the moment of heroic death and refused to move forward. Everything after was inconvenient. Everything after complicated the meaning. Because if the story continues, it becomes harder to celebrate. The image of defiant warriors is interrupted by the image of empty houses, by seized women, by children growing up in foreign lands, by lives unmade in silence. The myth cannot survive contact with those details. So they were trimmed away, left out, forgotten on purpose. History did not lie, it simply stopped early. And in that stopping, the suffering that followed was denied its place. The legend remained intact. The cost was buried. Thermopylae became a shrine to courage, while the lives shattered in its shadow were allowed to disappear without witness. What happened after Thermopylae was not an anomaly. It was a template. Across empires and centuries, the sequence repeats with mechanical precision. Men are killed, cities fall, and women are absorbed into the machinery of the victor. Different flags, different languages, same outcome. Conquest is always followed by redistribution, and human lives are always part of the allocation. The Persians did not invent this. They inherited it, refined it, normalized it. Long before Greece, other lands had been emptied the same way. Long after, others would be as well. The method changes, the justification changes. The result does not. Women become labor. Women become status. Women become proof that resistance has ended. Thermopylae is remembered because it fits the story we like to tell about war. The women taken after it are forgotten because they reveal the story we try to avoid. That war does not end when the fighting stops. It simply changes shape. And the first to be reshaped are always those without swords. There are no monuments for them, no carved names, no stone that says where they ended or who they once were. The women taken after Thermopylae did not die in places that kept records. They vanished into households, into fields, into rooms where history was never written. Their endings were private, their suffering was undocumented. Their existence dissolved into the daily function of an empire that had no interest in remembering the defeated. Some would die young, worn down by labor and distance. Some would live long enough to forget the sound of their own language. Some would raise children who never knew Greece as anything more than a faint story, told in a voice careful not to be overheard. And when they died, they would be buried as servants, as property, as nothing at all. No one would mark the place. No one would return. This is where the story truly ends, not in glory, not in sacrifice, but in disappearance, in lives that slipped out of history without leaving a shadow behind. Thermopylae has a monument, the women do not, and in that imbalance, the full cost of the legend finally becomes visible. The women of Thermopylae did not vanish because history forgot them. They vanished because history was never meant to hold them. Their suffering was too quiet, too inconvenient, too incompatible with the narrative of heroism and valor. The same mountains that echoed the clash of spears remained mute to their cries. The same valleys that witnessed bravery never recorded the fear, the tears, the endless march that followed. And yet, their story endures in fragments, in abandoned villages, in scattered ruins, in the faint traces of Greek names whispered in foreign lands. It survives in the absence, in the silences between the lines of celebrated chronicles. To remember them is not just to honor the lost. It is to confront the fuller, harsher truth of war. That victory always has a shadow, and that shadow is often the women who were meant to be invisible. Their lives remind us that the cost of battle is never only counted in the fallen at the front. It is counted in the lives, broken behind them, in histories never written, and in human endurance that defies erasure, even when the world insists on forgetting.